Class Exam Tracker Setup tutorial. This is part 1. Now, you may have already done this, but the first step is to download your cluster's respective exam tracker. And you have to do this locally because otherwise you wouldn't have edit access. For the sake of demonstration, I'm going to use the Business Administration Tracker. This is for principal events. If you are ever confused which one it is, by the way, you can hover over them in Notion and you will see the little names show up. To download a Notion, it's super easy. You just have to click. And then you'll get a little pop-up and hit allow. This just means you can download it. And from there, you can navigate to your downloads, click open, and, well, it'll open. Before we get started on talking about macros, let's talk about the tabs. You have 3 main tabs that you will be using. The first is going to be the Setup and Manual tab. This is your cheat sheet to reference if you ever forget, for example, what a feature does, or what the different terms are within the datasheet, or even how to set up macros. You can also come back and rewatch these videos at any time, obviously, but this is within the document to make it easier for you. The next up is the Student tab dashboard. This is where you're going to see your stats. We have a macro for our testing analytics that'll turn all the raw data into actionable insights, which will be super useful for you. This is where you will spend most of your time learning. Finally, we have the Data tab. This is where you're going to fill in your data. You should view this as the last tab in your dashboard because this red tab down here, Analysis, is full of a bunch of formulas and references you really don't want to touch. Feel free to look. It's super cool. It took me a really long time. But if you edit anything, you do run the risk of all of the macros and connections breaking, and that would be really sad. So before we get to inputting data, which we'll go over in the next video, we have one last setup task, which is to enable macros. Macros are basically scripts of code that we run when we want our Excel to do a more complicated task than maybe a function or a formula could do. To reduce lag, our macro for testing analytics only kicks in when you hit a button on the Student Dashboard tab. Now, it is really important to note at just the beginning that my laptop runs on a Mac OS system, so this is going to look different than for Windows users. But don't worry, I didn't forget about you. I will go over how to set you up in just a second. All right, setting up Mac OS macros on Excel. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our menu bar right at the top and click Excel. Then we're going to scroll down to Preferences, and then from here we're going to get this little pop-up. I do want to point out, depending on how old your computer is, you may not have security and privacy separated. This may just be security and privacy. Regardless, if it's just security and privacy as a combined, click that. If it's separated, click security. Now that we have it open, we see that there are 3 different levels of macro security. You don't have to worry about developer macro settings, and in fact, I recommend you keep that off if you are not actively using it. You can choose between disable all macros with notification or enable all macros with or enable all macros. I do not recommend you enable all macros on because while I can vouch for the safety of this file, you can't vouch for the safety of every file on the internet, and you don't want to potentially download something that could break your computer. You cannot choose disable all macros out notification, however, because that will break. This will not allow you to gain any insights from this, and it'll turn into just a big blobby brick of a file. At this point, you're just going to hit the option that you decide, click out of it, and you're good to go. At this point, I already have it set up on my computer, and it won't sufficiently do the pop-ups that I want to demonstrate, but you would close out the file, you would close out your Excel, and you would reopen the file after you've restarted the app. At that point, you'll get a little pop-up that says, do you want to enable or disable macros for this? At that point, just hit enable macros and you're good to go. If you did choose in those settings to hit enable all macros, you won't have that pop-up, but that's okay because even without data, we can test to make sure that macros are able to run on our computer. We're just going to go to the Student Dashboard tab and hit this button. This is the button that runs the macro within our computer. As soon as we get this little update complete pop-up, we know that we have macros enabled. For Windows, it's very similar. Because I'm on Mac OS, I wasn't able to get any screenshots, but it's the same core idea. You go to your files in your App Preferences. From there, you go to Options and then Trust Center. From inside Trust Center, you're going to scroll down to Macro Settings and hit Enable All Macros and then OK. At that point, you're just going to restart your Excel and test it the exact same thing as how I would have done it on Mac. And then congratulations! That is the setup for the Go for Glass exam tracker. If you have any bugs that you notice, feel free to use the linked Padlet on the Notion to report them. We will be actively moderating this. This is brand new, so there's nothing up yet, but as people ask questions, we will provide solutions. So if you're the first poster, you may not see anything, but if you're watching this a little bit down the road, we recommend reading through because someone may have already asked the same question as you. Additionally, if you'd like to provide feedback, we'd love to hear it and see it. And yeah, we'll see you in part 2, and that'll be going over how to input data.